So here we are in our second video about Greece. We've talked about Athens. We've talked about the democracy in Athens, and in class we've also talked about the art and culture of Athens. And one thing to remember about Athens is that when we make connections with the Greek world in the West, it's mostly in Athens, right? Because we emulate their government, we emulate their art, we emulate their education, right? And so Athens is the center of culture, and it's the center of what we draw back to when we talk about Greek history. However, there is another important city-state that contrasts with Athens, and that city-state is Sparta. Okay. Now, some of you might know Sparta, especially some of the guys might have seen the movie The 300 or whatever. This is one of those situations where take what you know and forget it, and let's start fresh. Okay. Sparta. Sparta was a Bronze Age city. It existed in the Trojan Wars and before that. In fact, according to Homer in the Iliad, Helen was a princess of Troy, a queen of Troy, of Sparta. That's where she was from. And so she was a Spartan. Now, what you probably know about Sparta is that it's military history, right? And the fact that it was a military state. And it was. We're going to talk about that. But it wasn't in the Bronze Age, and it wasn't even at the beginning of the Classical Age. And what we have is an event that occurs that causes Sparta to decide to become a military state. Now, that event was a war, of course. Sparta is located on the lower end of the peninsula of Greece. Athens is on one side of the peninsula, and then you have that very small isthmus, and then you have another peninsula, and Sparta is in that southern peninsula. They went through a period of population growth, and because of that population growth, they need to expand their territory, so they decided to do that by conquering their neighbors, and their neighbors was the Messenians. Now, this is not to be confused with the Mycenaeans. These are different people, right? The Messenian people were larger than the Spartans, larger in population. They had more room, which is exactly what the Spartans needed. But the Spartans, being very clever, creative, they won the war. It's a bloody, like maybe 10-year war that they fought with the Messenians, and they eventually took over their land and enslaved their population. And this will be a very important part of why Sparta becomes a military state. Because now it's great. Sparta has more land, so they've accomplished their goal. But now they have this large slave population of Messenians, which they will call helots, Helots, right? And they have to rule over these slaves and make sure they stay in line. And they are outnumbered by those slaves by the thousands, many, many more Messenians than there are Spartans. And so the king of Sparta at the time, and again, this is kind of mixture of history and legend. We're really not sure if this guy actually existed, but his name was Lycurgus. And Lycurgus decides that if Sparta is going to continue and be a powerful state ruling over a large slave population, then Sparta has to look at the military life and decide to make it a profession, right? So Lycurgus goes around to all the Mediterranean world and collects all the military strategies and the military technology and plans that he can, brings it back to Sparta, applies that, plus Greek phalanx traditional fighting, and creates the military state that we know as Sparta. Now, one thing that's... Well, I'm going backwards. Just a second. That's going to be annoying if I have to do that every time, right? But we're started, so we'll just do it if we have to do it. Now, one of the things to understand about the Spartans is that they have no designs of conquest. You would think that if you're going to create one of the most impressive and elite military forces in the history of the world, that you would be ready to conquer some things. But that's not the point of the Spartan military. This is very important to understand. The Spartans became an elite fighting force, not to conquer Greece, but simply to keep peace at home, right? Let me explain. We explain this by looking at Spartan society. At the top of Spartan society, in this pyramid, we have the Spartan citizens, and these are the homoioi, okay? And the homoioi is the name for Spartan citizen, and they were the ones, men and women. All the men were soldiers. All the women, had babies, hopefully males that would become soldiers, and they numbered in about like 8 to 10,000, right? Now, since all the men are soldiers, who builds things, who makes things, who does like the economy? Well, those were free people living in the Spartan state, known as periokoi. Now, they were not official Spartan citizens, but they were able to live there in exchange for goods. They would make weapons, they would make dishes and pots and pans, they would build things, and they are the free people, right? And these people would move in and offer their services. The Spartans would decide, yes, you can. And so they would live in this area. This is about 60,000 people, right? So the Spartans are about 10,000. The Perikoi, the middle class workers, are about 60,000, not slaves. The slaves were the Helots, right? These were the Messenian people that were enslaved by the Spartans. The Helots number about 100,000. So 10,000 Spartans, 100,000 slaves. That's why Sparta became a military state, to control their large, very large slave population. I'm going to try this. Hold on. Oh, we're just skipping all over the place. Excuse me. All right. So, this is what we just described. Like Spartan society, 8 to 10,000, and the Spartan slaves, 100,000. Okay, so read over that. The PowerPoint's online. Read over the PowerPoint. This is what we just explained. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Spartan government. Now, in Spartan government, it's very strange. And you just look at the pyramid and you're like, this doesn't make any sense, right? You have two kings. But here's what we need to understand about Sparta. The most important thing about Sparta was not the kings or not the military. The most important thing about Sparta was the law, right? The law set forth by Lycurgus. And the law stated some fundamental things, right? That Sparta is supposed to be the most important thing in your life. The city-state is supposed to be what you live for, what you die for, and that change is bad, okay? So nothing should ever change in Sparta. Everything should stay the same. Okay, so we start at the top of the government with two kings. Why would you have two kings? The idea of a king is that he's the one in charge. There's only one. Why would you have two kings? Well, remember when we talked just a second ago about how nothing is supposed to change. Well, the two kings kind of keeps that idea alive. If one king wants one thing and the other king does not, then it's off the table, right? King has veto power. Both kings have to agree, based on Spartan law, the way forward, and then it happens. And so kind of a checks and balances system with two kings. So it sounds crazy, but it was meant to keep things the same, right? Now, the ephors. This is an interesting group, right? The ephors are a group of Spartans, a small group of Spartans that are elected by the citizenry to serve as government advisors for 1 year. Okay, so their job is to advise the kings and take care of the education, military system. They were in charge of everything. So a very powerful position, but they only had it for 1 year, right? If the two kings agreed on a certain path forward and the ephors disagreed, then it didn't happen, right? So it has to be, again, checks and balances. But here's the thing. You're a very powerful Spartan citizen for a year. However, after the year is up, then the Spartan citizens can accuse you of any crimes that you might have committed during that year. And if you are found guilty, you can be executed or exiled. And so as an ephor, you're constantly checking yourself. Have I done anything that I can be accused of? Have I done anything wrong that someone after my year is up would say, you're guilty, and I would be put on trial, right? And so ephor always has to be looking over his back, even though immense power, but it's also only for a year. Now, the Gerousia. These are an interesting group of people. These are old Spartans, which in a way is kind of an oxymoron because the point of Sparta is to die in battle, so you never get old. But these guys, for one reason or another, maybe they're really tough, maybe they're lucky, they have survived to old age in Sparta, too old to fight, right? So what do? Well, let's make a group of them and let them advise the government. So they would also advise the ephors and advise the kings because they had the most experience, right? And so they were thought of as very important, but not necessarily as big as the ephors. So the Gerousia are the old guys. Okay, let me do this. Ah, that works. Okay, so again, this is just what we explained. Two kings, checks and balances. The ephors are the 5 Spartans. There were 5 of them. They would control the military and the education and advise the kings. And they were very powerful, but only for a year. And then finally, the Gerousia are the old Spartans. Now, here's what's interesting about that. In a way, being an old Spartan is somewhat of a humiliation because you kind of failed in your mission to die for your city-state, you know? But in another way, you are very respected because you have survived. So there's a balance there. People respect you and they don't respect you, right? Okay, now here is any guys out there who think it would be really cool to be a Spartan because you saw the movie 300. Think about this, okay? The Spartan education system. Sparta was a military communist state in that, and by communist we mean that the city-state owned everything, including the children, right? So what Sparta was trying to create is a system of the best, right? The best of the best is what you hear in like militaries all the time. They want the best of the best. Well, Sparta wanted the best of the best, and that started at birth. A child was born and inspected by the government. If the child was deformed, if the child was sickly or small, then the child would be killed. It's called infanticide, right? I think boys would be thrown off a cliff, girls, that type of thing. And the girls would be exposed to die. And so they don't make any apologies about it. They want the best of the best. And if that baby that's a day old is not the best of the best, then it has to go, right? Now, at about age 7, the child grows up in the home till age 7. And at age 7, the boy goes to an education system known as the AWHonorsSparta1. Look, it's AGOGE. It's the PowerPoint's online, right? And the AWHonorsSparta1 was his home from the time he's 7 to the time he graduates and becomes a Spartan soldier. He no longer lives with mommy, and they don't get any of that, right? And so occasionally you might see his mom out around town, but it doesn't matter because he is now owned by the state. He's not like going home to eat, cookies and milk. He's owned by the state. And so in this starts his military training. And he gets, basic education, writing, reading, math, but he also gets a lot of outdoor activity. And the outdoor activity is not dodgeball. The outdoor activity is marching and phalanx. And so they start the phalanx stuff when they're, straight line, that type of thing, age 7, 8, 9. Now, so you have like an adult that does all this, but the discipline and the real oversight is done by boys who are a few years older. Here's what you have to imagine. Let's say that discipline in elementary school is provided by the biggest bullies in 7th and 8th grade. And so you take those big guys and you go down to 3rd grade, and those guys make sure the kids behave. What methods are they going to use to make those kids behave? Exactly, right? They're going to beat them up, they're going to push them around, and no one's there to say stop. Bullying was welcomed in Sparta. It made you tougher, and that's what the Spartans wanted. So if you survived this, and again, some kids would die. They didn't care because they wanted the best of the best. So if you survived this till about age 13, then you were keep moving up levels to 13 and then 16, right? And you survive. Eventually, you were given a paternomos, and a paternomos was a mentor. So by 16, they figured, okay, you're going to make it. And so they give you a Spartan adult, and that Spartan adult comes and teaches you the ropes. So pull you aside every now and then, take you and tutor you, on like being a Spartan. And so when you graduate around 18 from the AWHonorsSparta1, then you would be in that person's unit. And so he would know you and you know him and you become familiar. And that was kind of the point of the military too, is to be very close as a unit. And so they would start growing fraternity in that unit very early on, right? 18, you graduate, you're able to get married, you're able to join your regiment. At 18, as a Spartan, as a male, your life begins, right? We'll talk about the marriage thing in a second. Okay. All right. What about the girls? Well, the girls would live at home, but the girls would also go every day to their own type of education, where they would learn how to do household things. Now, don't get the idea that they're just learning how to cook and clean, because the men only fought and they spent all their efforts doing that. The women had to do everything else. So it's not just cooking and cleaning; it's a matter of running the house, taking care of everything else, the slaves, and so they ran the show. Spartan women actually had more power than Athenian women because they had more responsibility. Their men were out fighting, and they had to do everything else, right? Now, let's talk about marriage, and this is interesting. With Sparta, of course, you don't have a lot of romance, so you forget that right away. But so the marriages were arranged, and you would have a guy who just graduated from Sparta school around age 18, and you'd have a girl about the same age. The parents would know each other, and they'd say, okay, this would be a good match. And so it would be decided for you who you would marry. Now, here's the wedding. On the night of the wedding, the woman would be taken into her bedroom. They would cut her hair short to make her look like a guy. Don't understand that. And she would wear a robe, and she would just go to bed. Sometime during the night, the man, the husband, who was living in a barracks with all the other soldiers, would sneak out in the middle of the night. Everybody knows he's doing it, but he sneaks out in the middle of the night, sneaks to his wife's house, sneaks in the window, and has sex with her and then gets back before daylight. Happy wedding, right? And so this was the ritual that they would go through for really the first 10 years of their marriage, right? The husband would come out of his barracks, and again, nobody was thinking that he would go, and they would know he would go, but they would act like they didn't know. He would go to his wife's house. He would sleep with her, and she would have babies, and they would live with her, and she would take care of them, and they wouldn't even know their dad until about age 30. And if he lived through age 30, then he could go home and spend some time with his family in addition to time in the barracks. But his life was with his men. His life was with his brothers in arms at the barracks. That's where he lived, right? So it's a strange ritual here. So the key, as we see here, everything is regulated by Spartan law. The law is the ultimate decider of everything, right? And so you cannot, even the kings cannot break laws. Law is the ultimate, right? Now, get this at the bottom. The highest honor for a Spartan man, remember our conversations about Hector and Achilles, the highest honor for a Spartan man is to die in battle, right? And so in Sparta, you only got your name on your tombstone if you died in battle. Now, what about women? Women don't fight. Well, the highest honor for a woman would be to die in childbirth, especially having a boy, right? And so if you're a woman and you died in childbirth, you got your name on your tombstone. If you were a man, you got your name on your tombstone by dying in battle, right? So here a picture of the Spartans. Maroon was their color, right? And they had the lambda symbol, which is kind of a V, upside down V symbol on their shields. All shields were the same, right? So one of the things I want to emphasize here is that it is a communist state. And by a communist state, it means everyone is the same. Now, they had military ranks. They had a captain, they had a king, right? But it didn't matter if you were a captain or a soldier. You lived in the same size house. You had the same plates and cups. You had the same table. You had the same size land, the same number of slaves that you farmed on. Everything was the same, and everything was given to you by the government. And so when we look at these Spartan soldiers, it's pretty accurate painting because they all look the same, because they all had the same stuff, the same robes, the same spear, the same shield, all issued to you by your communist government, right? And so that was the thing. No jealousy, no social classes. As far as the Spartan citizens were concerned, everything was the same. Now, one more thing about the Helots before we move into the Persian Wars. The Helots, you would think, okay, so they're slaves, but if you treat them nice, then maybe they won't try to rebel. That's shaky at best, but some people might think that. However, the Helots hated the Spartans, and that was consistent all the way through the history of Sparta. So it was necessary for the Spartans to be very cruel to the Helots, and they were. You wanted to kill a slave, kill a slave. The slaves weren't owned by you, they were owned by the state, right? They had a group of young Spartans that usually they just graduated, but they show a lot of promise, and so they are inducted into this secret society called the Crypteia. And in the Crypteia, their job was to sneak out at night and kill Helots in their sleep, right? And so if you have a Helot that talks back, if you have a Helot that's too smart for his own good, then the next day you'd wake up and he'd be dead, right? And so the Crypteia was part of that. And that's part of the intimidation factor that the Spartans pushed on the Helots. And the Helots were terrified of the Spartans, but they also hated them very, very much, right? Okay, so let's talk about the Persian Wars. Okay, we got a little bit of this when we talked about the Persian chapter, right? The Persian chapter, of course, Persia was the largest empire, and we talked about how their government system was very effective with the idea of provinces and governors and the ruling kind of like a live and let live mentality, which is going to be a successful equation for ruling an empire throughout. The most successful empires adopt the Persian model. But there are some people who resisted this idea that let us take you over and then you can live your lives and we'll actually make it better. And those people were the Greeks. Now, to point this out, again, the Persian Empire is this large gold space here. The Greeks is the green space, right? And so when we talk underdog, they were the underdogs. Now, we discussed the battles very briefly in the last chapter, but let's look at them together. We have four major battles of the Persian Wars, right? We have Marathon, we have Thermopylae, we have Salamis, and we have Plataea. Okay, so let's go through those quickly. Okay, remember the beginning of the war. The beginning of the war is there was a Greek colony, Ionia, that rebelled against the Persians and asked the Greeks for help. The city-state of Athens decided to chip in, so they sent money and materials to Ionia. Ionia is crushed by the larger Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire gets wind that the Athenians helped. And so that gives the Persian king reason to go and invade Greece. And his objective, of course, is to get to Athens. And so we have the Battle of Marathon. In Marathon, the Greek king Darius sends a force of about 60,000, thinks that's plenty, to the city, or to the coast, to march to the city of Athens and burn it to the ground, right? Now, the Athenians ask for help. Not a lot of help comes. A few cities donate troops. Sparta is who they really want help from. So the Athenians send a messenger to Sparta and say, hey, could you please come help? Well, Sparta was in the middle of a ritual to, I think, Apollo. And so they said, we can't leave. We have to do a ritual. After the ritual will come. But again, Spartan law says we have to stay and do this ritual, so we're not going anywhere until it's done. Sparta, right? So Athens is on their own. So the Persians see the Athenian troops and say, that's not many troops at all. We got 60,000 and they got 10,000. Let's divide our force and we'll attack the city from two sides. So the Persians take their forces and sail around the coast of Greece to attack Athens from the south as well as the north. Well, the Athenians know this is happening. They see it happen. And so they send a messenger back to the city and they say, look, they might be coming to get you in a few days. If you don't hear from us by Tuesday, then you need to get the heck out of the city because they're coming and they're going to attack from behind and the front. You need to just abandon the city. So if you don't hear from us, leave. All right, so on the morning of the attack, the Athenians decide it's time. And they just dress up in their armor and just charge down onto the beach where the Persians are camped. And long story short, they just decimate the Persians. Whether the Persians weren't ready for the attack, whether the Persians weren't as well equipped, and that's something that is definitely a difference in this war, that the Greeks have better armor, better helmets, better shields, and so that superior weaponry also makes it easier. And also the phalanx. These are very united. They've known each other all their lives, and they fight in this phalanx all the time. And they're fighting these Persians that are from all over the Persian Empire. You saw how big that was. And they're not used to fighting as a group. So all those things are weaknesses and strengths for the Greeks. And so the Greeks are able to decimate the Persians in this Battle of Marathon. Now, problem. The Athenians are still waiting on word from the battle. They're about to abandon the city. The army now has time to march back to the city and defend it against the other Persian force, right? But the people in Athens don't know that. So the general of the Athenians asked for a volunteer. And the volunteer was known to history as Phidippides. Phidippides just says, I'll go back to the city. And again, remember, no horses here. So Phidippides has to run. It's a 24-mile stretch from the beach to the city. Phidippides has to run back to the city after fighting a huge battle. Right? He takes off his armor and he runs back to the city. He goes into the city. People see him. They're like, oh, it's Phidippides. And he says the word Nike, and then he dies of exhaustion. According to this is the legend. He dies of exhaustion. And of course, Nike means victory. And so we have the message from Marathon, we have a victory, don't abandon the city. That's what Phidippides is supposed to deliver. So, again, lots of connections here with current today things as well as the ancient world. The Marathon is around 24, 26 miles long, and that's the distance from the beach to the city. Yeah, I had a teacher at my old school whose wife would go run the original marathon every year. They have an event where you can run from the beach at Marathon all the way back to Athens, and she would do that. It was interesting. It would be interesting. Now, I told him if she really wanted to do it, she would have to fight a battle and then strip naked and run, but they don't do that anymore. It's clothed. Okay, so that's the first battle. It's a victory for the Athenians. The Persians go home, but don't forget, and the Spartans are left out in the cold. The Spartans have the reputation of being the greatest army in Greece, and they missed the biggest battle so far. And so the Spartans show up a week later, and all you see are bodies just piled on the beach. And they're like, ah. And so I believe that sticks in the Spartan mind a little bit, that if they have an opportunity, because the Athenians are getting all the glory, and the Spartans were absent, Now, Darius dies, his son Xerxes comes to the throne, and Xerxes wants to invade again, and this time do it right. So he gets all his army together, this huge Persian army, different reports of different numbers, 100,000 to 500,000, this huge Persian army, and they march across into Greece. Now, the city-states know this is coming, so they band together and say, we have to stop this Persian invasion. And the Spartans are put in charge because they're the guys who are the experts, and they're willing now to participate. And so the Spartan king, a guy named Leonidas, says, there's no way that we're ready now to take on this huge Persian force, but we can slow them down. So he asks for some volunteers, gets about 10,000 volunteers. He goes back to Sparta and gets 300 of his best soldiers. And they go together to this place called Thermopylae. Thermopylae literally means the hot gates. And it was a place that had hot springs, and people would go there to vacation and things. And so they set up at Thermopylae to stop the Persian advance. Now, this is a great place to do that because you have cliff walls on one side, you have a cliff that goes down to the ocean on the other side, and you have a very small space. So you can bottleneck the Persian force and slow them down. So they set their phalanx right in the path of the Persians, and for 3 days the Persians smash against the Greek phalanx. They lose, some reports, up to 60,000 men, the Persians do, trying to get past the Greeks. Finally, a spy comes forward. His name is Ephialtes, a Greek shepherd boy, and he goes to the Persian king Xerxes and he says, I know a way around the pass. I know a mountain path that we could take to get around behind the Spartans, right? And so he does. He shows them, they pay him gold, and then on the morning of the third day, the Persians are coming up behind the Greeks. The Greeks wake up to see them. They're surrounded. Leonidas orders all the allies to leave and go back home, and he stays there with his 300 Spartans. Now, why doesn't he flee too? Fight another day, right? Spartan law says no retreat. You cannot retreat in war, according to Spartan law. And the most important thing in Sparta is the law. So according to their laws, the 300 Spartans stand and die on the third day. Their shields are bashed in, their spears are broken, their swords are like dull, and they are fighting with their hands. And finally, the Persians surround them and just shoot arrows at them until they're all dead because they don't want to have to fight them hand to hand anymore, right? So it is a Persian victory, but it is a costly victory in that the Persians lose a lot of men, but psychologically they see, what are we up against here? When 10,000 Greeks can hold off our force for 3 days, what can 50,000 Greeks do? So the Persians are getting a little worried. However, they do win the battle, and they're able to march down to Athens, and they're able to get into the city, and they burn it. They burn the Acropolis. They burn everything, right? Okay, so Thermopylae. Let's continue. Oh, this is good. Here is a map of, if you go there today, it's vastly different. The sea has retreated a little bit, and so there's a lot of land, and there's no more cliff. What we see here is the large red square of the Persians, and then the Spartans here, the blue, the Spartans and the other Greeks, and the cliff here. And so the choice of the Persians is that they either had to go through the Spartans, smash up against the cliff wall here, or fall into the ocean. And that's what the Spartans wanted. They wanted to build this they built a wall and a phalanx, and they would just push them over the side of the ocean as they came in. And it made it a lot easier for the Greeks to hold off such a much larger force. Okay, here's a cheesy painting of it. There. And here's the statue of King Leonidas. Right? This was done much later. This was not done in the ancient world. Later, the Greek government would come and create this statue of Leonidas. But one thing that was put there during the times of ancient Greece, and it was done a few years after the war ended by the Spartans, it was a plaque, and the plaque had existed there since the ancient times. And the plaque said, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Again, the law said no retreat, no surrender, and that's what they did. They obeyed the law and they died, right? And that was kind of the quote of the Spartans. Yeah? Okay, so let's continue with the war. Okay, the Athenians know that the Persians are coming, so the Athenians abandon the city before they get there, and the Persians kind of walk in, and if there's anyone left, they kill them and they just burn the city. The Athenians, however, retreat to a bay called Salamis, and it's pretty close to the city. The stories are that they could see the flames of Athens from where they were. The guy in charge is Themistocles. Themistocles is the Athenian leader at the time, and he hatches a plot because he knows that Ephialtes, and oh, by the way, Ephialtes was the spy who told the Persian king. In the Greek language today, Ephialtes means nightmare, right? He's their Benedict Arnold, yeah? Okay, so Themistocles knows that the Persians are gullible, And so he sends a guy to Xerxes and says, "Oh, the Athenians are defeated. They're very sad. They're huddled in this little bay called Salamis. If you get there really quickly, then you can kill them and they won't escape." Well, Xerxes takes the bay, and he puts all his ships together and he sails all night long to get around to Salamis and attack the Athenians. But the Athenians have set an ambush. Their ships, Spartan ships, right, are waiting in this bay to close in on the Persians and kill them, right? And so when the Persians sail into this big bay, the Spartans and the Athenians and other ships from other city-states close in on them, and they are able to pick off the Persian ships one at a time because the bay is so small that they can't maneuver, right? And so this is a great naval victory for the Greeks, and it decimates the Persian fleet. And so after this battle, Xerxes goes home and leaves the war in the hands of his generals. And finally, the last battle is Plataea. And Plataea, I call Sparta's revenge because a group of about 10,000, 10,000 Spartans and maybe 70,000 other troops from other Greek city-states band together and fight the remaining forces of the Persians and just wipe them out, right? And after Plataea, the Persians don't even attempt to come back and try to invade Greece anymore. Okay, so this is a great victory for the Greeks, right? They're able to defeat the mighty Persian Empire and remain independent, which was their goal. Here's a map of Salamis. We can see here the bay, right? That the Persians like sail into the bay ready to just kill a bunch of sad people that are on the shore. And instead, they're met with a mighty fleet that sails into them. The Greeks are, of course, great sailors, and were able to, with their strategies and the surprise attack, were able to defeat the Persians. And if you're a Greek hoplite soldier and you fall into the water and swim to shore, nothing's going to happen to you, right? Because you're in Greece. If you're a Persian soldier and you fall into the water and swim to shore, you're going to get killed because you're in a foreign country. So they also, home field advantage helped a lot too with the Greeks. Now the Greeks had a type of ship, and that ship was called a trireme. Let me show you a picture. Okay, trireme has 3 levels, trireme, right? And each level was full of oars. And so you had slaves that would row these ships. They would be flat on top, and so that's where your hoplites would be. And of course, there were no cannons back then, so you couldn't like shoot from one side to the other. At one point, the Greeks do develop what we call Greek fire, which is kind of a flamethrower that would shoot out of these ships and catch other ships on fire. But the biggest offensive weapon that you have in the trireme is ramming. You see the nose of the trireme here. That nose was a huge bronze metal tip, right, that would smash into the side of ships. So you would maneuver around to where you would be sailing right into the side of a ship. You would smash your ship into the side of that ship, and at the same time, the hoplite soldiers would jump across onto the enemy ship and fight, right? So these, I guess, were the first Marines. They were, fought on land and sea, and they would jump from ship to ship and, fight from ship to ship. And that's what the Persians, their ships were so close together because they were all stuck in that bay that the Greeks were able to jump from one Persian ship to the other and just kill indiscriminately and wipe out the Persian fleet. So the trireme was a great Greek weapon, especially for the Athenians, who were great sailors. There is, again, Plataea, Sparta's revenge. So that's what we get to. Now, so Athens is victorious. Sparta is also victorious, but Sparta just goes home. Again, Sparta is a city-state where you could say they don't play well with others. So once the war is over, Sparta's ready to get back to normal. We're going to go back to Sparta and ignore all you guys, right? Athens, however, takes advantage of that. They come into a period of a rebirth. Right, they go into the city, and it's devastated. They rebuild the city, and they have the largest navy now because they defeated. And Sparta has the great army. Athens has the great navy, and a leader named Pericles. And Pericles is going to come to power in Athens and going to rebuild Athens and make it really the greatest that it had ever been. He had 3 goals for Athens. He's going to strengthen the Athenian democracy. He's going to hold and strengthen the Athenian empire, and it's an empire now. And he's going to glorify Athens. Right. So those are his 3 goals. So, remember, Athens already had a democracy, but Pericles is going to increase that. He increased the number of paid officials. He increased the salaries of government workers. He had more citizens involved in government than any other time in the city-state. And it became an honor to be a public official in Athens. That's what you wanted to be. Athens became one of the most democratic governments in history under Pericles. So Pericles expands democracy, gets all the citizens involved. Remember, he's not a king. He's not even a tyrant. He's just a guy who has dreams, and they put him in charge, and he leads that government, right? So he strengthens and expands the democracy of Athens. Now, where did Athens get an empire? I thought it was just a city-state. Well, after the war, Athens becomes the leader of a group of city-states because it has the strongest navy. After the war, they don't know if Persia is going to come back or not. We know from history that they didn't, but they thought maybe there would be a Persian invasion next year or the next year, and so they had to be ready. So they create an alliance of city-states known as the Delian League, and these are all those city-states in the northern part of Greece, not on the southern peninsula, but the northern side of the peninsula. All those city-states ally with Athens. And this was to protect against future Persian invasion. Now, what Athens really said was, look, we have the largest navy. If you pay us money, then we'll protect you. And so the city-states, instead of building their own navies, would just pay Athens the money, and Athens promised to protect them, right? Well, Athens had plenty of ships. They don't really need to be building more ships. And so what Pericles did is take this money and use it to rebuild Athens. And that really made some of the other city-states angry. But he could do whatever he wanted to with the money because they were smaller city-states and he was larger, right? So that was a tribute. The smaller city-states paid tribute to Athens. And the fleet protected Greece from invasion, which, of course, as we know now, never really came. So as we said before, Pericles used the money to rebuild Athens and especially rebuild the Acropolis. And we looked at these PowerPoints in class, so I'm not going to go into great detail of that. But